I've had a couple experiences that have completely changed how I think about upgrading telescopes, and I think some people fall into what I call the glass trap. Today, we're talking about refractor upgrades right here on Night Sky Voyager. A refractor telescope is the stereotypical kind that you think of that you hold up to your eye. They function by having a lens or series of lenses at the one end that gather light. Think of the telescope that Galileo might have used or Captain Jack Sparrow, that kind of thing. Modern refractors fall into two major categories, and the one has several subgroups underneath it. But in both cases, what they're trying to do is resolve an issue called chromatic aberration. The best way I can describe chromatic aberration is when you think of that Pink Floyd album with the prism on the front where the white light is coming in and the rainbow is coming out on the other side. The prism effect, as we're all aware of, splits light into its different colors. But that also happens at a telescope. And so over time, we have come up with more and more complex ways of solving that issue. So an achromatic refractor has two lenses in the end, and it adjusts for some chromatic aberration, but it doesn't correct in the blue and purple range. And so bright objects that you see through an achromat will tend to have a blue to purple fringe around them. The other category of refractors is called apochromats, and essentially all they're doing is taking steps to further reduce chromatic aberration. And they do that in a variety of ways. We won't do a deep dive into that here. So what this is really about is what I'll call the glass trap, and it's addressing that difference between great views and perfect views. Chromatic aberration is certainly an issue, but especially since this is a visual astronomy channel for the most part, for visual uses, apochromats are really kind of overkill. So where does chromatic aberration usually show up? I've had the opportunity to own several achromat refractors over the years, but I've also looked through many apochromats. And I will tell you that yes, there is a difference, but the issues, especially in my extensive experience with my own telescopes, is that chromatic aberration is the worst on really, really bright objects. I've seen it on Jupiter, Venus for sure. Really bright planets like Sirius or Vega will show it. But number one, how often are you actually just looking at Sirius or Vega? That's not that often. And it shows up on the planets as really just kind of a fringe on the outside. It doesn't actually do all that much to degrade the actual image of the planet. It just is this false color kind of ring or halo that shows up around the bright objects. And I'll say it is present on the moon, but usually if you're using high magnification on the moon, it really doesn't cause that many issues in my experience. And beyond those really bright objects, it's really not an issue at all, especially on any sort of deep sky objects, globular clusters or open clusters or any nebulae. It's not going to be existent at all. They're simply not bright enough to show enough chromatic aberration for your eye to detect it. So why would you buy a refractor over other kinds of telescopes? That's really not a topic for this video, but one of the reasons that people do buy refractors is because they don't have a central obstruction, and so the contrast of the images that they produce is much higher for fine detail. Another reason that people might buy a refractor, specifically an apochromat, is if you're doing astrophotography, they're great. They're totally necessary, though, if you're doing photography, because the chromatic aberration on long exposures is much worse than it would be when you're just visually looking at it. And so you'll see that a lot of astrophotographers use really high-end apochromatic refractors to take their pictures. So I've owned several refractors over the years, and my very first major telescope was a 120 millimeter refractor, and I used to take that to public programs quite a bit. And one thing that I really remember was we had this program and Jupiter was high in the sky, and this young kid came up probably 8 to 10 years old, and he looked through the telescope and he saw Jupiter, and he looked at me and said, "Why is it covered in purple explosions?" He was really taken back by it, but the color fringing really in that instance, it was very apparent in that telescope. The point was though that while that aberration was there, you could still see Jupiter perfectly fine in very crisp, high detail. And so he didn't lose anything from that. It was just an additional aberration there, and it took me about 2 seconds to explain to him that it was an artifact in place by the telescope. But it was a funny story to hear anyway. Even more so, one of my first trips to Cherry Springs with that 120 millimeter refractor, we were early in the night and we were looking at Saturn. Saturn was prominent and it wasn't quite dark enough. And probably 10 yards away from me was a guy with a ridiculously expensive Takahashi fluorite refractor. And both of us were looking at Saturn, and he asked if I minded if he came over and took a look at it through my telescope also. And I said, sure, why not? And I'll never forget, he stepped up to the eyepiece and looked in, and then he looked at me and said, I can't believe that. I don't know why I spent thousands and thousands of dollars more for an image that is only marginally better. Saturn, in my experience, isn't bright enough to really show all that much chromatic aberration, at least not enough to bother me. And clearly this guy didn't feel like his telescope at that additional cost really made all that much of a difference. So the real difference where these come in is price, in that apochromatic refractors are much more expensive than achromats. And so I pulled some quick prices and looking at the market, right? So you've seen probably in some of my videos, I had this 6-inch refractor that's an achromat, and it's from Celestron. And that one, you could buy the OTA, the optical tube for that, for about $1,000. Explore Scientific makes a similar one that they're selling for about $800. So you can get a nice 6-inch refractor for between $800 and $1,000 without a mount. Now, conversely, I was looking at some apochromats, and both in the 6-inch size to kind of do an equal comparison. Explore Scientific had one that was $2,600, and there was another brand, Skywatcher, that had one for $4,100. So if we're just looking at that, you're going from almost more than double to almost 4 times as much cost for a apochromatic refractor over a really good-sized achromat. That is a significant price jump. I don't care who you are. It is a lot. And for the amount of objects that are severely impacted by chromatic aberration through an achromat, that additional cost is very rarely worth the case. Now, if you fall into one of these cases where you're someone who does astrophotography, or you're a very discerning, advanced planetary observer, then it may be worth it to you. But especially for beginners or even intermediate users, basically most visual users, I don't see that there is that much of an improvement bearing that amount of cost. And again, the point I'll drive home is that it only affects a select few of really bright objects. If you're looking at galaxies or nebulae or any of those other kind of fainter deep sky objects, it's going to be non-existent for you. It's not even going to be an issue. And you're going to get the benefit of that nice crisp refractor view that you may be missing out with on some other telescopes. So I find refractors to be a really pleasing view when you're especially looking at deep sky objects. They put up just really tack-sharp images that are impressive. One thing that you might want to think about, though, is chromatic aberration is reduced the longer the focal length is. And so refractors that are longer focal length will show much less chromatic aberration. But all in all, as far as the glass trap is concerned, your atmospheric conditions and your observing skill are going to have way more impact on what you see through a refractor than whether you have an achromat or apochromat. That apochromat will give you a better view 100% of the time, undoubtedly, but the cost that you have to bear in order to get that, I would say, is in diminishing returns, especially for visual use telescopes. If you found this video useful, consider giving it a like and subscribe to my channel if you like what I do here. It really helps me to grow. Also, I've got a merch store, and there's specials going on there about every other week. If you want to show that you're part of the community, take a look there. Or if you want to go the extra step and support the channel as a channel member, you can get early access to my videos, and I really appreciate your support of the channel. This is Trevor from Night Sky Voyager. Thanks for watching.